Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Orozco Garcia. Thank you for coming. I'm a pilot DD at Sony Pictures Imageworks. And as the title of the presentation suggests, I will be speaking about sequencer and Python and some tool development for that. As for the contents of the presentation, I will start talking a little bit about me, my experience, and who I am, and how we do layout at SPI. Python, why, when, and how we use it, specifically talking about sequencer, some tool examples, and finally the conclusion. So let's start. So who I am. My journey started with studying animation and digital arts. I learned the basics, so I did some modeling, I did some drawing. That was actually my drawing over there, the horse I did it. And after that, I did a game design diploma when I learned the basics from Unreal. Fun fact, my final project was made in Unreal 4.12 or 13, something like that. And it's the one over there with the ball and all of the tiny characters. And big shout out to my team that they were really great in that project. And then I also took a one-year diploma in technical arts, which helped me to get more in-depth knowledge about the engine and some other softwares. And after graduation, I started working in Sony Pictures Imageworks. First, as a production services technician, working with the delivery pipeline and also the render queue, which gave me more knowledge about how to do things in Sony, how everything works. And I was able to move after that to the pipeline department since 2022. And those are the movies that I've been created for: Seabeast, Quantumania, and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. When Spider-Verse wrapped, I moved into the real-time department, and currently my role is a real-time pipeline DD, where I give support and development for a real engine pipeline. With the first project using our new layout pipeline being K-pop Demon Hunters. It will be available on streaming on June 20th. The movie looks great and is super fun, so please don't miss it. And all of the tools that I'll be showing today were made with this movie in mind, with suggestions and feedbacks from the layout team in this movie, taking into consideration all the workflows and their needs. So now let's get started. And of course, this is not a sponsor at all, so I'm just very proud about this movie. So layout in Unreal Engine. This is how a basic project looks for us. A main level sequence represents an actual sequence in the movie. We can place the shots over there and make sequence-wide changes in the parent level sequence. So we can make animation over here, and we can also make shot-specific animation over here inside the shots. Like we can make camera animation, we can make character animation, but this is also not the only way. If the artist wants, they can also make sub-level sequence over here, and they can make animated characters over here, so they are not constrained by that. It depends on the workflow of each of the artists and how they manage their scenes. And for the actors, we chose this structure with different folders when we place one asset, different kind of assets for folder. So the camera goes in the camera folder, characters go into character folder, and so on. This not only helps us to keep things tidy and organized, but it also helps with tool development, and also it mimics the structure that we have in Maya, because we also have groups with a similar naming, so that is good. Click. And these are some of the very basic tasks that a layout artist can do. They can spawn and post characters, they can do the animation, they can animate cameras, of course. They can change the shot lengths of the shots and replace it and move it around. They can to conform it to what the editorial sensors or to the storyboard. Set dressing and way more. So whatever the sequences calls for, they can also maybe do some lighting or some effects depending on what is needed to sell the story and to get their idea. So after repeating these processes over and over again for all of the shots, they are done. It's done. And now they can set it to animation. It's very simple, it's very easy, it's intuitive, and yes, everything was there in the presentation. Okay? Or maybe not. We have to make modifications. So there are many possibilities or many options that we have to make modifications to our current sequence. Maybe because editorial apply changes and we have to conform or shots to what they sent us. They might change the lengths. They might add new shots or split one shot into multiple ones. Or maybe new shots get added. Maybe one character now doesn't need to be there. Or maybe just the artist had a new idea that they want to try out and want to show it to someone. There are many cases. So the question now is, how do we start to doing that? How do we tackle them? And more importantly, without messing around everything that we already have. Well, it definitely depends on what we are trying to accomplish. So for example, to expand the shot length, we can do it the manual way. We can just take the shot, like if I want to expand this one, I can just move all of these ones to the left, right, actually. And then I can just expand the shot length, and it will be like this. But there's one tiny caveat with this. And if I have any shot range inside here, I will also have to dig into this shot and move all of the ranges to max the new length, which is time consuming. If I want to add a new shot, I can do a similar process where I take a shot or an existing shot, I update the ranges like I already mentioned, and I can have also to fix the frame ranges. In our pipeline, we usually want to start by defaulting in the frame 1001. So if I create a new shot, I also have to go into the shot and change the frame range to start in 1001. So then again, very time consuming. And these two cases are not too bad if I have to do it 1 or 2 times, but what happens if the sequence has more than 50 shots and I have to modify each of them? This is not very good. So there might be a better way to do it. Which comes now to Python in Unreal Engine and or to development for these cases. But when do I use Python and what are the advantages against doing everything in editor utility widgets or doing everything in blueprints? Sometimes it depends on the situation and the person that is doing each of the tools. Because some of these tools have already utility widgets, so you might be wondering why I go all the way now to call Python if I'm already doing the utility widgets in blueprints. There is no right answer, of course. And it might depend on your vision or how do you manage your projects or your tools. In my case, I started learning programming with Java, and then I moved to Python. So in my case, it's very easier to visualize the functions in a text base instead of blueprints. So here's a tiny example of how to do something in Python. In this specific example, I just grab the focus sequence, and then I just get the bindings. And if I find something called money, I can just rename it. This looks cleaner. And this is the exact same function, but now in blueprints. This is not too bad, but this exemplifies one of the pet peeves with blueprints, which is the for loop with break. This is also not too bad, but if I have to do it with a larger function, this might be a little bit confusing, this tiny break. But maybe I'm just not good at organizing blueprints, so that's entirely on me. But there are cases where Python is the only choice that we have. For example, with proprietary modules that we have in Sony, we have this cool function that already someone did in our development team, so I can just grab this function, I can import the module, and just do it. And also, it doesn't apply only for this, but also for external or third-party modules. We can import it, and use it in Python. Python has a bunch of available modules at your disposal. And for command line tools, Python is really helpful if you want to do one action over your current sequence. Like on the example that I made earlier, if I want to modify the naming of my current sequence, I can just run this on the console, and that would be done. And it might not be very impactful if I can do it 2 or 3 times, but if I have to do it over and over again, this is very time-saving. That being said, I don't hate blueprints, of course, and they are a powerful tool, and I combine them both with development tools. So, for example, when I'm starting to investigate a new tool or to see what is needed, like to make the planning, sometimes I experiment and find it easier to just drop nodes into the blueprint. And the cool thing about this is that you can start typing what you want. Like in this case, I knew that I wanted to work with tracks, or you can type sections or whatever concept that you want to look, and you get a bunch of different suggestions that tells you the different commands that you can use. And the cool thing is that each of these functions and the description matches to the API, the Python API that you have here. So this is really helpful if you want to do some quick prototyping and find the different functions that you have or you want to use. And of course, for editor utility, for editor utility widgets and all of the UI logic is even though I can use Python and PyQt to do UI, groupings and utility widgets are really powerful. So it's easier sometimes to just drag and drop all of the tools that I need, and it makes it easier to make UI and to connect all of the events to the specific Python function that we want. For example, on this is our picker. So if I want to add logic into this toggle, I can just make it in groupings. Like if I press it, it turns red like this. If I press it again, it goes green. So that is very quickly to set up in groupings. And a picker is a great example of a complicated tool, a complex tool made of very simple bits. So because a picker, the action behind a picker, what is needed is actually just needs to pick, to select a button. So in reality, we just need a function like this, something that gets the focus level sequence, and you can get the proxies, the rig proxies, and then you just call this function to select the control name. That is pretty basic, but you can get something as complicated as this to get one button assigned to one specific control each. And also you can add onto that. We have some functions to key the selected controls or to reset or to copy animation, paste animation. We can add different ways to select. We can select everything, all of the controls, or we can key, unkey, we can mirror. We can do a bunch of different things just using basic functions. And coming back to the toggles for FKIK, we can have something like this. It's almost the same function as earlier, but here we can use the contour sequencer library to get the value, and then we just flip it with not value. So based on these considerations, I'd like to introduce you to some of the tools that we have developed. And the main functionality of this was made in Python and exposed to the users using editor utility widgets. Not saying that all of our tools are made this way, but the ones I'm showing now are specifically like this, where the main functionality is in Python. So the first one would be the sequencer manager, which when I was making this presentation, I realized that sequencer toolkit would make a better name to say what it's supposed to be doing. But yeah, this is a tool that contains a bunch of different tools and functions that layout artists are doing over and over again. And the goal is to make these tasks automatic, all of these common tasks are automatic, and they prevent human error, and to maintain the studio structure. Coming back to the example for offsetting tracks, if I want to update the frame range from this, our goal is not to just set the frame range of this. We also want to modify everything, so the shot structure, all of the shots after this shot, also move accordingly to what the new frame range for this is, to make a space for that, basically. We can achieve this result by using this tool already included in the engine called stretch shrink. I just have to set the value here, and it will automatically move all of the shots to the position that I want. But there's one tiny caveat with this tool, and it's that this tiny keyframe that I have here, I was careful, super careful to animate that according to this shot. So I want to keep that frame relative to whatever happens on this shot. So this tool doesn't work for that. But wait, it actually works. But I only had to move the marker to be before the frame range to work. So in this case, it was user error. It was my error, and I admit it. But I know that I will be making that error over and over again, because it's hard to remember that I had to place the marker here and put it in here. But it's also, you see the shot, I also have to manually put it all the way here after I run the tool. So maybe we can do it better. So this would be the Python way to do it. we can make a function to change the frame range of the selected shot. And we have this module over here that contains a bunch of our mostly commonly used functions. And the reason for this is because when I was doing some of these tools, I found out that they were started on 5.2, but a couple of them now are deprecated. So it's easier if you put everything in one single module and then just update it. If they deprecate something, you can just go to this module and modify this instead of modifying every single time that it appears all over your code. And a small parenthesis on this function is that something that you have to remember always when you are doing tool development is that you have to consider the user expectations. And because when we are running something that modifies our sequencer data or modifies our work, we have to make sure that it always add a way to undo. Because we don't want to mess everything that is happening on our artists, and we have to have the ability to go back to the previous state. And in Python, this is achieved really easily with this class, the scope editor transaction, and the with keyword. So whatever is inside this block, it will be added to the stack, the undo stack with this name. For example, I have this frame rate changer, and I can just undo and undo. It will have the same name. So this is really helpful to go back. But also loading bars, because it's really important to tell the user that they have to wait. For example, because long-running Python codes, they look really similar to a frozen engine, so we don't want to think that it's actually frozen when it is thinking. So with loading bars, they know that they have to let it cook. So, and we can combine them both, actually. So this is the exact same function that I had before. Now it has a scope editor transaction to undo, and it has a scope slow task to have a loading bar. So, and continuing to the change frame range, this function only finds the selected shots. So I have the selected shots and calls this other function. So let's take a look at it. And this is the stuff where it started happening already. We grab the section data over here to get the start frame and get the end frame. And we can update the end frame or the start frame depending on what we want to modify. And we can just adjust with the offset that we provide to this function. But this is only affecting the specific section that we are selecting. But I mentioned that we want to modify everything else besides also the shot that we are selecting. So this is what I'm doing right here. I'm getting the tracks for all of for my foreground sequence, I am getting the tracks. And then I call this function that is called chop track. And you might be wondering why is it called chop instead of just offset, but I will be going into that in a second. But this is the function that applies all the offsets into the other shots that we want. And for that tiny little keyframe that I had, we can also do something like this to get the bindings, get the tracks from the bindings, the sections, the channels, and offset each of the keyframes inside the channel, which would look something like this. So from the channel, the specific channel we select, we can get all of the keys, we can get the frame value for the key, and then just apply the same offset to each of the keys. And the final result will look like this. So I can select the shot. I can specify how many frames I want to move it. It can be positive or negative. Then I just run the tool. And we can either call them directly in the console or implement, like I did here, a small UI to test it. And unlike the engine function that I mentioned earlier, the shrink and stretch, I can have this playhead anywhere I want. And I can just select the shot, and it will be moved, which is more intuitive than having to put the playhead here, and then I have to move the shot. So this works better, and this makes my life easier now. But there's also another difference with the engine function, and that is coming with selections that are in between the shot track, in between subsequences. For example, in this case, I want to change the frame range of this shot. So it will be something like this, but it will be extended. But as you can see, this level sequence moved all over here. But when I was doing this level sequence, I was careful enough to put the animation of this should be matching this shot, because that's what I animated with. I used the camera from this shot, and the animation I have here is very specific to this shot. Same thing for this part, and same thing for this part. But now that I run the tool, this is moved, and this is mess, and it ruined my entire work. So in reality, this is more what I would be expecting the tool to run. Now I have this part here that still matches my shot. I have this that still matches everything. And I'm coming back to the chop function. This is when it comes back. I can do it manually. Like if I just grab the sequence, I duplicate it, and I just place it all the way here, I can accomplish what I wanted to do. It's pretty easy and it's pretty easy and simple, but as I mentioned earlier, doing this with a lot of sequences is very time consuming, and we don't want to do it that manually. So we can do better. And we can create a function to do it. And same as before, we can get the selected tracks, and we can run the chop function that I already mentioned. Which would look something like this. This receives the frame that we want to chop it, and we receive the track that we want to modify. And we just run the chop section. This is really helpful to put different functions into to make small functions, because this way you can reutilize it somewhere else in other of the tools if you need it. And also in this case, I have an if section, because in some cases you don't want to chop every section, you don't want to modify everything, you just want to modify where this frame is from. And like I mentioned before, one way to do the chop functionality would be by copying the section and then paste it in wherever I want, which is what I'm doing here in this Python code. This is an example also how to use the copy and paste functions. There's a copy and paste function for different kinds of assets in Sequencer. So in this case, it's section, but it can be copy and paste tracks. It can be copy and paste bindings. There's one for each. And then I can add the offset that I want. And again, I made a little UI to exemplify. So I can select the sub-level sequence, and I can just run the function to chop, which works pretty similar to the knife tool in Premiere, if you are familiar with that, or with other video editing software. So this is also really helpful if you are familiar with some other software to copy that functionality into Unreal to work with your sequencer. So now with this amount of functions that we have, we can put them together into one single UI that works for the artist. And we can start building more complicated tools. And we can add extra checks and parameters to check what functions we want to offset, like if we want to include or not include the sequencer markers. If we have here, we can also offset them, depending on what of the extension that we want to do on the shot. And this frame ranger tool is one of the examples that we have in the sequencer manager or sequencer toolkit that we have in SPI. And this will be the tool running. So I expanded, and my subsequence expands, and my shot expands, and everything is good with this. Well, almost everything is good with this, because there is one tiny little issue with this function running. And that is splitting the subsequence. So this subsequence that got split here and here, it is actually using the same level sequence asset. So I cannot modify this one, like I cannot extend it to be here and just modify this section, because this section and this section are basically the same. So any changes I do inside here will also apply here, and I don't want that. So what can we do? In this case, we will need to duplicate the level sequence and then just use that in the shot. So that is pretty easy. And we have a tool for do that. So we have this that we can just click and we can select the shot, and that would automatically do what I just mentioned for us. And it works very simple. I have also the copy sections again. I have the paste sections function, that the same thing that I did beforehand. I can reuse it to duplicate the section. The only difference is this function that duplicates the asset, which is just getting the sequence, is running the duplicated function, and just sets the sequence to that new section. Then the result will be something like this, with a duplicated asset that I can modify, and without worrying about losing my previous work, because I can modify this now. And now let's talk about adding shots. Like, with the same functions that we already have, we can repurpose them and make a new tool to add new shots. Because we are able to offset the entire sequence, we can put the shot wherever we want it to be. The only thing that is missing is creating the shot asset itself, but that is very straightforward process. We can just run the get assets tool, and we can just create a new asset, use the correct class that we want to create, in this case a new level sequence, use a level sequence factory, and we can, I mentioned earlier that the frame range for us, we would like to make it the default 1001, so I can just do it part of the function to match our pipeline. And finally, we just add it to the level sequence wherever we want it to be. So we set the frame range, and it would look something like this. So you have the shot, and I create the shot, and everything that comes after gets moved automatically to make a space to the new shot, which is really helpful. And this is another example of the same tool running. You can see with more sequences, I can also get the same result. I can get these duplicated sequences over here, and I can get the space to get a new shot. In this case, I didn't create any shot asset or I didn't offset this because I wanted to do it myself. But if you check it or check it, you can manage how the tool behaves. So that's really good also, because you give option to the artist to run the tool whatever they want, and for the specific cases that they want to use it. And this is another common action that layout artists do, that is bind cameras. So they sometimes put a long level sequence like this with one camera animation all over here. And because we have different shots with the camera code track here, and each shot has camera code track, we would like to use these code tracks to render. So our target is to use this camera here, this camera here, this camera here, and so on. Which we can do with something like this. We can get all of the bindings in the source sequence and try to find the specific camera that we want. Or we can just get all of the cameras in the sequencer and just get the first one if we want, for this case. This is important when working with proxies in a different subsequence. For example, this one. I have a camera proxy here that needs to be attached to the camera code track in this one. So they are different subsequences. So in those cases, we have to use this function, the get portable binding ID, because they are coming from different sequences. So this way we can build the relative path to that camera proxy using the target sequence that we want to use and the binding proxy, which would be the camera that we already find from the other sequence. And in the end, we can just bind it to the shot track, code track. And to get the cameras in the sequence, we can just do something simple like this. Because every camera component is a possessable, we can just find all of them and then just check if that possessable is a camera component, then that's a camera, and we can just get all of the cameras there. And this is another function, another tool that is copying tracks. So in this example, like I mentioned earlier, we have different folders for each of our assets. So that makes it easier for us to make tools like this that allows us to copy only the environment, only the camera, only the character, and so on. And it works something like this. So in this case, I have this sub-level sequence that have some character, some camera with some keyframes, and I want to be able to copy that to that shot that is completely empty. So I just select both of them. I select which assets I want to copy. In this case, it's all. And I just click the button to run the tool. And now everything I had in the other sub-level sequence was copied into that. And you might be wondering why I just didn't Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V in this case. Well, that is because sometimes in your, let me go back. In your level sequence like this might have an offset applied, and this might have an offset applied. So this tool automatically applies that offset, so the keyframes from this level sequence matches whatever it was showing in this shot. So that's something that you can do automatically with a Python function that wouldn't be available if you just use the Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V. And this is another one of the tools. This is separately from our shot tracks and all of that specific stuff. And this is based on some other tool that we have in Maya. So big shout out to the maintainers of that version. But I was tasked to do something similar in Unreal. And the main purpose of this tool is to take animation data gathered from our renders and be able to select specific poses or animation ranges to copy that to our current scene. And this is particularly helpful if we want to go back into one specific version, or if we want to bring animation from another project or other sequence without having to go into that project or sequence and export it manually and going back. And so to get the data, first I have to mention that we use the movie render queue to launch on renders. Then on our render presets, we have our burning class, like this. And we use that because we can implement this custom event over here that gets us something like this over. This will be this node will be represented with something like this. And this is pretty easy to do. It's just one Unreal class, one simple node, and it just calls our function to get the values. And we can get it each frame, so we can get the data for each of the frames and write it to disk. In our case, we use JSON files to get the data. And to apply the animation back, we can read the JSON file that I just mentioned, and we can save it into a dictionary, and we can use the tracks from the control rig to reapply the animation, which comes back to the sequencer part of my presentation. All of the control rigs have a track and sections, and each of the controls are represented by a channel in the sequencer. So if I have all of the animation already in a JSON, I can apply the transformation that I saved into each of the sections that I had in the sequencer, something like this. So I have a control name, I have the section of the control, and I can apply just the transformation that I want. So I can get the translation, the rotation, and the scale into that specific frame number. And in that way, I can bring the animation from the JSON file into here. It's also possible to use the control rig sequencer library functions. But something that we found out with this approach is that if I run it with the values for each of the controls, this process tends to be really long, especially for long sequences. And using the channels is way faster than that. So if we already have the value from the sequencer delivery, we can just reapply the same values in here. So this would be the tool running. So we can select the sequence that we want. We can go into the specific data. We can go into the version that we had. I created a bunch of versions just for testing. From here in the UI, we can visualize or we can select which character we want to apply the pose. It will be to Manny. And we can see in this slider the pose changing. So we can see what specific pose we want to apply, go into that, and apply. It will be applied to the current frame. Or I can also apply to the range. I can apply the entire animation that was saved in this data file. It will be reapplied now in my current project, which is really cool, I think. But I mentioned that this tool already existed in Maya, and we had Maya-specific data from this, and it would be great to bring all of the data that I apply from there, from Maya to Unreal. But there's one issue with that, and that is that this controller over here has the same values applied as these ones over here, but you can see that it doesn't match. So how can we solve that? We can just write the global export from the controllers or the joints into the JSON file, and we can just do some simple math to bring it back. So this is kind of the way that we use to write animation. We can get the control rigs, the rig proxies, again, as I mentioned before, with the picker. We can get the hosting actor. The root component will be the skeletal mesh, and each of the sockets from that would be the joint. And we can get the transformation for each of the joints, and that way we save the global export for each joint. And then we just do simple math, which is just a fancy way to represent a swap from the list. So you can see this would be the way to convert it. So this is the y-axis, z-axis, the edge swap, and the same y-axis, z-axis, and the edge swap. So if you know what would be the result matrix for this, you can just swap the indexes of the list, and that would be fine. You don't have to actually do the math in Python. That would be painful. And the last tool, I don't have a real demo for this, but it's something that is currently in development, and I want to bring it up. That is the round trip tool. Like I mentioned before, we have different asset types, the camera, characters, environment, props. We can use this tool to import or export data, depending on which selection we have, to Maya and Unreal, back and forth. And it automatically builds the level sequencer, meaning that if we run this same tool in Maya, we can export the sequencer data, all of the shots and all of that. We can get all of those shot lengths and position to Unreal using the same function that I mentioned, and we can also export keyframes. And using a Python UI in this case, no utility widgets, just to show that it's possible. And other thing that we have some Python functions would be exporting and asset publishing, but to learn more about that, you can attend tomorrow's presentation by John Wan. He is our real-time pipeline supervisor, so don't miss it. Okay, and some final thoughts about this process. So when doing tool development and doing all of this stuff, something that was really helpful for me was to always communicate with the artists and keeping in mind their workflows and needs. Because all of these tools were made with a lot of back and forth with them and all of the suggestions. Sometimes when they ask for something, my first reaction was like, why don't you use this that is already in the engine, or this tool that we already have in Unreal? Sometimes they just don't know about it, so it's good to just have the communication going. But sometimes, like in my case with the shot and that specific keyframes, when you start talking about them, you see why exactly the current tools are not working for them, so you can start improving onto that. Also, taking advantage of familiarity. Like if you have one different tool that works the way that you want, you can just try to replicate that in your tool set. Like what I mentioned with the chop tracks, or that is pretty similar to the knife tool in Premiere and other video editing software. So if you have that reference, you can just replicate that into Unreal and make sequencer work for you in this case. And always experiment. Like, if you get a request and you don't know exactly how to do it, try to do it in different ways and see what works better. Sometimes something might work or seemingly work, but if you start experimenting, you see, oh, this is not quite right, this is missing something. And there is a ton of tools in Unreal, and it's impossible to know all of them, so just try everything. And like I mentioned, Control-C is very important. So the goal with tool development is to modify the work, but also to preserve everything that we want to modify. So that's a little bit tricky, but also try to make sure that whatever you do is only done into that specific case, and you are not affecting anything else in the work. And that would be it. Thank you.